if you're the kind of person who is burdened by a sense of guilt and responsibility, there is a path forward to, eliminate that from your sense of, the political shape of the world and the political shape of your own life. And yet we're not moving, I think, nearly fast enough to sort of embrace that opportunity.
I was trying to think. So we met at that dinner, like, when was this? This is 2017, I guess, right? In New York.
Sounds ballpark right to me, yeah.
Yeah. I think that was it, right? This is right before Uninhabitable Earth came out?
It was, it was probably, yeah. I mean, the book came out in 2019. Somewhere in that ballpark, 2017, 2018. It might be like closer to a landmark day in your life than mine. So
yes.
if you're like, it was definitely 2017. I'm sure you're right.
No, actually, I don't know when I think I was there because Conspiracy had just come out, but I don't remember. I feel like the pandemic has totally fucked with my sense of time. Like everything seems very recent and very far away all at the same time.
Yeah, it could also be like getting older, I think.
That is true. It does blur together. Yeah, like when you're younger, like even, okay, so let's say that was 4 or 5 years ago. Like 5 years used to be a long amount of time, right? Like because
it's your whole life in high school.
Yeah, you'd only been through a number of 5-year spans. And then as you go through more of them, it all blurs together. Well,
yeah, it's something I think about a lot with my kids, which is that I'm as like any parent is, I'm constantly amazed at how fast they're growing up. And then you're like, oh, I'm aging at the same exact speed.
Yes.
Which doesn't occur to any of us, but
my youngest was like 9 months old when the pandemic started. And so, those like little frames that you have where you take like the 9-month photo and then the 10-month photo and the 11th. We just stopped. It's like that's when the Titanic hit the iceberg and my watch stopped. You know what I mean? Like, so right. We have this like weird, like that's when it happened, kind of a thing. So your kids do help you benchmark. It is funny. I wrote this email a while ago where I was saying like, every time you like cut your kids' nails or every time you take them to get your haircut, you think it's like this wonderful moment, which it is, but then it's also a terrible moment if you think about it, because that's like a one-way street. Not just getting older, but it's a one-way street for both of you, like heading towards a place where that won't happen anymore.
Yeah, my older daughter, who's 4.5, has never had her hair cut. And we were just talking about it the other day, and my wife was like, I think that means like the end of your hair may have been inside me. And it's amazing to think that that's like...
Oh, right. That's both beautiful and weird. Yeah.
Anyway.
So I was talking to, I thought you would like this. I was talking to John M. Barry, who wrote The Great Influenza recently. And I read his book, Rising Tide, many years ago, which I think is kind of a climate change book. It's certainly about what happens when we fuck with the climate and the consequences therein. So I was like, okay, so you wrote this book like 15 years ago about climate change, basically, or 20 years ago about climate change. Then things have gotten worse. Then you wrote this book about pandemics. And then that was like sort of eerily prescient. And I was like, could you stop writing books about these topics? That would be nice. And we laughed at it. And then later in the interview, he mentions, I said the phrase church and state. And he's like, I wrote a book about that too. Which I did not know. And I read, he wrote this book about the invention, like we think of America being founded as people who fled religious persecution, right? Which is kind of true. Mm-hmm. But they weren't seeking religious freedom for everyone.
Were trying to establish religious societies, just their own.
Yeah, they were attempting to set up a religious theocracy for their religion. Right. And it's only this guy, Roger Williams, who sort of differs from that, goes on to found the state of Rhode Island. But I was like, God damn it. Could you stop writing about the terrible things that are happening right now in the world, but the historical prequel to them? And then I guess it's just like humans have always struggled with these things and struggled with collective action problems, with thinking about complicated topics. And then we're so often at the mercy of mercy and at the saved by heroic or evil individuals who sort of decide to exert their will on everyone else.
And now we're in a situation on a number of fronts where, one big question is whether these are unprecedented challenges or whether we just feel that they are.
Yeah.
It's something we can talk about, but it's something that I feel differently about almost like every minute of every day. I can find myself thinking, especially the climate crisis, but also the whole sort of polycrisis that we're living through right now is really daunting in its scale and unprecedented and has no meaningful analog in human history. And then there are other times and other ways of looking at it where I think, this is obviously very serious, and managing it poorly will result in an enormous amount of suffering, and probably even managing it well will result in some amount of real suffering. But the question of how we relate to it emotionally, politically, philosophically, I think is kind of an open one. And I do wonder / worry a little bit whether or to what degree our sort of presentism and our cultural present tense apocalyptic impulses, to which I've contributed, are pulling us towards a darker vision of what we're living through now and what we're heading towards than someone in 50 or 100 years might think looking back. I don't know.
Epictetus said that philosophy wasn't this dry, abstract thing. It was a thing, he said, you should be talking about, writing down, reading about, exploring with other people all the time. He said, constantly have it at hand. That's how I think about philosophy. And it's weird. For the last 5 years, every single day, I've been writing this free email about Stoic philosophy. It's been not just cool to meet all these fellow practitioners of Stoic philosophy, but in writing about it, talking about it, reading it for our podcast, I have got to internalize these ideas in a way that I never would have been able to under any other circumstances. That's the idea. Philosophy is something we're supposed to engage in, not keep in these dusty old books or read once and be done with. It's a constant process. And I think that's why the email has worked so well for the people reading about it and sharing it and talking about it, all of that as well. So I'd love to have you join us on this email. You can sign up at dailystoic.com/daily email. It's totally free, no spam. You can unsubscribe whenever you want. I've basically given away a book for free every single year for 5 years, and I'm gonna keep on doing it until I drop dead. Check it out, dailystoic.com/daily email. Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that. I not in the sort of don't look up sense of like how do you stay positive? But I am curious, as someone whose job it is to write about or to seek out almost universally unpleasant information, right? Like the data that you look at, the people that you talk to, whether it's your COVID reporting or your climate change reporting, like you're talking to the people who are looking at the worst information that there is, right? Like the things at the fringes or at the extremes or the doomsday scenarios. And then on top of that, you're a journalist, which means that you're sort of in this media culture of presentism and social media and, sort of competitiveness and the day-to-day news cycle, which isn't super healthy, just even when you're not talking doomsday scenarios. How do you manage to stay sane within that? I don't mean like, how do you see the good in everything, but how does that not just break your brain? Because it seems like it could break someone's brain.
I guess I look at it from the opposite perspective, which is to say that if I wasn't seeking out that information, then I'd be turning away from what knowledge there was to help us guide thinking about where we are and where we're going. So, the alternative world in which journalists like me are telling just the good news and our media just has a good news bias, and that would actually be a really scary world for me to live in, because I would think that there would be an enormous number of threats that we weren't taking very seriously, but which were very real. It's, I think, to some degree, a matter of just pure temperament. And probably it's a sign that I have some amount of sociopathic / journalistic distance, that I'm able to write about these stories sort of as stories. But the fact is that we are living through this enormous transformation, and taking that seriously means looking very hard at where we are, looking very hard at where we're going, and not shying away from whatever might be embedded in that information that is quite scary. So, to talk in slightly less abstracted terms, talk about climate change for a second. Like the planet's like 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than it was before the Industrial Revolution, and that, which doesn't sound like very much, but it literally means it is warmer now than at any point, and at any point previous to this one in the entire history of human civilization. So the planet's already warmer than at any point when there were humans around to walk around and talk about it. So much of what we know of as human history, our politics, our agriculture, our culture, our psychology, our everything, is the result of cultures that arose from climate conditions that are no longer here. And that means that we are today embarked on a genuine experiment, which is to say how much of what we have can survive and how much can't, how much will have to be transformed. I don't think it's like, doomsaying to look into the future with that frame. I think it's just honest. And I think
it's not good or bad. It just is. It's facts are facts.
And there those people who are like, well, we've gotten through challenges in the past. I do think that wisdom is valid, although I also don't think it's total. And I don't think that we can assume success based on previous, usually mixed success. But I also don't want to let that sort of crowd out for me, the central dramatic, emotional, political, philosophical question of our time, which is just how are we going to survive in this new world that we're making for ourselves?
No, I get that. And I totally understand the duty of it. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be doing it. I'm more saying it's like if I was talking to a police officer or a special forces operator, you're seeing dark shit on a daily basis, right? Like your job forces you to stare into a kind of abyss, right? Their job does, but also yours. I'm asking, like, how do you actually process and think through that? Or does it just not affect you and you just see it as sort of like, this is the information I'm processing, my job is to make sense of it and tell that story? I sense, though, from your writing that there's a moral element of it to you that alarms you and scares you and upsets you. So how, as you day in and day out are living in that world, like how do you not bring that home? How does it not depress you? How do you function with the climate in your work that you have to acclimate to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have an especially satisfactory answer to it because, I can tell you the way that it affects me, which is at an abstract and intellectual moral level more than at a base emotional psychological level. That may make me well-suited to this work, or it may make me a sociopath who has no business talking about these things. I don't entirely know. And I think it is important that I came to these stories as a journalist, which is to say a sort of someone who's making narrative out of the messiness of the world. And on these two big stories in particular, climate change and the pandemic, it was the bigness of the story that really excited me, which is to say I didn't find it intimidating or overwhelming. I mean, in certain ways overwhelming and intimidating, but in other ways, I just found it exciting to be carried along on a huge drama. And the pandemic in particular was fascinating in the sense that as a reporter, which I sort of am part-time, I guess you could say, it was amazing to be very rapidly pulled into a saga that no one understood because the disease was so novel. And you could talk to experts who had, rules of thumb they were carrying from other, epidemiological experience. And there were ways of sort of conceptually modeling it based on previous influenzas or respiratory illnesses, et cetera. But we have not seen anything like this pandemic in 100 years. You know, a novel disease that literally infected the entire planet within a couple of years. And we were all figuring it out from scratch at the start. Now, at the time, I think the world as a whole responded in terror, primarily. You know, they were like, let's bunker down. Let's cut ourselves off from one another. We need to protect ourselves. We don't know what this is. And I didn't fight that impulse myself. I wasn't like, no, I want to be going out to, you know, nightclubs in March of 2020. But I was also really pulled forward and excited by the idea that there was a grand historical narrative that was not only unfolding through the time of our lives, but had just begun, and in which I wasn't behind anyone else who had more expertise. I was able to, like, as much as anyone who is not, you know, a scientific expert in, you know, respiratory infection, I was like as well positioned to be understanding that at the vanguard as anyone else in the world. And that felt really, really exciting, particularly in contrast to writing about climate, where no matter how expert I ever got, I would always know that there were thousands of people who knew the material actually much deeper than I did, and who could, like, understand the physics of ocean currents and explain them in a way that I probably never would be able to. And it's one of the sort of strange facts of my life now is that I am in certain ways this expert, and in other ways this total novice. You know, the other day I had a couple of interviews on CNN and MSNBC, and I like literally walked off set and like did an interview with a climate scientist. And I was just like, let's start from scratch, like, really big picture, like, you know, and it's like disorienting to be playing both an expert and an ignoramus. But I think it's also, there's something sort of, it reflects our, you know, everyone's basic ignorance about so much of what's transpiring in the world. And that the more that we can, you know, try to do both of those things, both understand how little we know and to do whatever we can to understand more. I think, to get back to your original question, the sort of more thoughtful and empowered we'll be about the future we're facing, both as individuals and sort of as a collective.
It is kind of weird because you think about history and you think about these moments, but like all the edges are rounded off those moments. It just feels like it's this thing that happened. You don't get the sense, it doesn't fully strike you that the people who were living in it were not aware of what it was, its significance, or where it would go. They were experiencing it day to day, right? So like the Depression happens, you know, the stock market crashes in 1929. Nobody knows that this is the Great Depression, right? They'd obviously lived through panics and things before, but they didn't know how big it would be. They certainly didn't know it would last this many years. They didn't know that this president would flub it and then this president would come in. Like they had no idea. It was just day-to-day life. And then so something like the pandemic happens, and this is also happening, I guess, with the climate, but it's over a longer time span. I don't just mean like decades, but just like years. So it doesn't feel the same way. But like the pandemic is one of those things where you're like, oh, this is history. This is the things that I read about. That's the day-to-dayness that I'm feeling. That's what World War II was like. That's what the Great Depression was like. That's what the Great Influenza was like. And that history is not fun, really. You know what I mean? Like just a reminder that like, this is what
especially for us now. Yeah, because I think one of the, you know, uncertainty about the course of the larger narratives in our lives was a much bigger part of human experience for all of human history. Sure. But we've sort of more recently started to believe that we were really profoundly in control of everything, or should be. Yeah. And I think it's a much deeper emotional violation to us to try to accept the basic uncertainties and embrace a sort of more humble perspective about what's about to come than it would have been 50 or 75 or 100 years ago, where we didn't even have models, let alone know that models didn't work all that well.
Yeah.
And so I think that we were all knocked off our feet a little bit more, and really wanted to believe that we could, if we had chosen to, stop this disease. I mean, especially across the West, there was this mantra all through 2020, we know what we need to do. And I think to some degree, we knew what tools we had. That's true. But I think that we really were flattering our capacity to fundamentally change the course of a once in a generation or once in a century pathogen. And, there were places in the world that did better and managed, especially by taking very, very rapid early action, were able to sort of eliminate the disease from their borders. But they were actually very few, and they were culturally relatively foreign from places like the US and Europe. And while in the
over
US,
a long enough time span, it evened out for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, now you're like, would you rather be living in China or the UK? Probably the UK. I mean, for many reasons, but even just on the pandemic front, like probably in the UK. And and yet we told ourselves all through the pandemic, we told ourselves these stories that it was essentially, we were living through not just history, we were living through a fable, which was revealing our virtue.
Yeah.
And we said in 2020, it's political malfeasance that our leadership was so broken about this, which I think, that's fair enough to say. But I also think that, it wasn't like Angela Merkel oversaw a dramatically better pandemic than Donald Trump did. It was better, but it wasn't categorically better. And these failures were really pervasive because the challenge is really hard and really human and not reducible to ideology or partisanship, which revealed itself, I think, again in 2021, where we told ourselves that the main driver of the disease was vaccination, which to a certain degree, again, was true. It was not untrue. But, the gaps in vaccination between red states and blue states, Republicans and Democrats, were large, but they were roughly comparable to the gaps by education, by race, by income. And we didn't want to see that complexity. We wanted to see pandemic death in 2021 almost as willful, and the people who chose not to get vaccinated as deserving whatever fate they got. I actually think we're in a slightly more healthy place narratively about the pandemic now because we've because of reinfections and because of breakthrough deaths, we've sort of dropped that pretense that pandemic suffering is elective. And we've started to just treat it as background noise, which is probably how earlier generations would have treated it, they would have gotten around to that point much more quickly because they were much more familiar with the idea that things were out of our control. But we're so addicted to the idea, especially the wealthy, powerful countries of the world, especially wealthy, powerful people in wealthy, powerful countries in the world. We're so addicted to the idea that we can control whatever we set about to control that we were just unwilling to admit that this virus was bigger than us, which it turns out to have been. I mean, it's literally infected the entire planet.
Well, no, it's interesting, this idea of what's in our control, what's out of our control. Do we come to terms with things? Do we practice acceptance? This is the essence of obviously of Stoicism. And I go back to the Antonine Plague. This plague breaks out in Rome. And it's not like a 1, 2, 3 year thing. I mean, the Antonine Plague lasts for 15 years, right? And I think one of the lessons we've wrongly learned in the modern world is that things happen quickly, right? Because yes, we still know things happen that are outside our control, but then we could, as you're saying, we figure them out, we come up with solutions, and then that's the end of them. The idea that this is how things are now is a more ancient, or we might like to believe antiquated idea, but that is the human experience, that new variables are introduced, new species are introduced, new events, things happen, and then, that becomes the new normal, as they say. But we're more interested in getting back to normal than we are to say, this is how the world is now. Although you wrote that piece recently where you're sort of talking about people who wanted COVID to go to the endemic phase, and you're like, endemic COVID is still pretty fucking bad. It's just because it's normal doesn't mean that normal is good or acceptable or even reasonable. It can still be quite tragic on a day-to-day basis. And
just at a population scale. I mean, It's one of the things that I think connects. I've been thinking a lot both about in climate and about the pandemic is just when you have impacts that are relatively trivial that affect a small number of people, but everyone is, they're applied to everyone, the numbers really add up. So even before vaccines, even in the initial phase of the pandemic, we're still talking about a infection fatality rate that was between 1% and 2%, which is and all of that was or not all of it, but most of that was concentrated in the very old. This is not Ebola, but Ebola doesn't infect the entire planet within a couple of years, and we had such a hard time wrapping our mind around that set of facts. Like, people either acted as though almost anybody getting infected was effectively getting like a death sentence and needed to run from the disease as though it was that scary, or that we didn't need to worry about the spread of the disease at all because nobody was going to die. And both of those are really, really misleading conceptual models for what we're going through, which may, depending on where we end up on climate, may also be true for our climate future, which is to say there's probably going to be considerable, really unconscionable levels of human suffering that come out of climate change as I see it. But it also isn't, I don't think, going to be the case that, every person on the planet alive in 2070 is going to look around and think that, we're living in a total hellscape. There's still going to be life going on. And we need to be able to think about both of those things as being true at once, that many are affected and suffering without the world ending as a result. But our emotional impulse is always to, if we're scared, to treat it as a sort of a universal apocalypse, which I think, I think it's not the best adaptation.
No, that's really interesting. It's like we have this blind spot for things. Like, it's like no one would want their country to become overrun and become a totalitarian state, right? This is an analogy. You would reject that, hopefully, but we struggle with dealing with understanding why we should care about a system that might be totalitarian for 0.01% of the population. Right. So it's like, it's unlikely you driving down the street, you're going to be harassed by the cops, thrown in jail, never see a lawyer, never see the light of day again. But and because of that, you're not that worried about it. But the fact that that potentiality exists for a small fraction of the population doesn't make it any less of a human travesty and any less of a sort of a problem that should be dealt with. So we struggle with this idea of like, what doesn't really affect me. And I'm not like seeing the bodies pile up in the street, or I'm not being paraded by the injustices. We struggle when things are happening to people or places or things at the margin. And as you said, when the world gets bigger and bigger and more interconnected, things that happen at the margins cumulatively mean a very large amount of people are negatively affected by this thing. And a lot of our best like the US legal system is supposed to be predicated, again, to go to this analogy, on the idea that like it's better that 100 guilty people go free than one innocent person be convicted. But it's hard to get a person to care about an innocent person getting convicted because that's not happening to the vast majority of people. And so that sort of fundamental,
who may also know more victims than know criminals.
Yes. So and you're actually getting upset that the people who are breaking car windows in San Francisco or shoplifting at the CVS are getting bought. And so that fundamental tenet of justice, that like you have to care about people you will never see or meet and bad things happening to them, that you have to care about that. It does feel like we're struggling both to agree about that and then is struggling even more to care about it or marshal resources to do anything about it in a lot of these problems, whether it's climate or COVID or criminal justice or, And
just to stick with your analogy for a second, that's not just how like creeping authoritarianism works. That's how real authoritarianism works too, because most people in an authoritarian state are not being policed in a daily way by the, right. They're living lives and they're thinking, well, it's nice to, there's no trash on the ground.
Yes. Yes.
And so it works all the way up. And I think about this a lot. I've been writing a fair amount about air pollution, which tells a very similar story, which is, the range of scientific work, but the high end estimates suggest something like 10 million people are dying every year annually from air pollution. And even the low end estimates are still in the millions. So we're talking about an unbelievably large toll. And yet it has, in some profound way, like not even registered.
Yeah.
On, our anybody's aside from a very small number of advocates, anybody's sense of, political, social outrage. There are a lot of reasons for that. It's complicated, but one of them is that, what we're talking about is an ambient, an ambient stressor, which is ultimately affecting a small fraction of people in certain parts of the world. And
not super visibly in the sense either. Like it's like I imagine dying from the effects of air pollution. It's probably comorbid with a lot of other things.
Yeah, totally.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not like you're just keeling over and dying, and then there's a mark on your face, and they say, "Oh, air pollution death." So the ambiguity of all of it too makes it easier. If you already didn't want to care, or you're already inclined not to care, it's conspiring with you so you don't have to.
But that part of it is really important too, in the sense that, so much of it is concentrated in particular in India, where, in Delhi, the average resident of Delhi's life expectancy is 10 years shorter than it would be without air pollution, which means every single person in Delhi on average could count on 10 extra years of life if there was no air pollution. That is just mind-bending. And it's especially wild when you think, okay, well, that's just the average. So for a lot of people, those effects are much, much bigger.
Yeah.
And so how much we care about those people when the average American life expectancy is being reduced only by 0.2 years or a couple of months by air pollution is really relevant. And in fact, I think in some perverse ways, the fact of pollution and our sense of the dirtiness of the developing world, and by dirtiness, I mean pollution, is making us, it's poisoned our sense of even what those people's lives could be like sufficiently that we treat it as just what it is there and not something that could be designed differently there, because we don't treat them in the same category of ultimately moral creature as we would treat someone who lived down the street from us or in our family. And part of that is natural, but part of that is totally inhumane and unforgivable.
Yeah, it's like they could get on a plane, although that might contribute to said air pollution, and land in a different country, and immediately their lifespan increases by 10 years. That's it. Like Tyler Cowen has talked a lot about this on immigration, and Alex Tarabek, his writing partner too. Just the idea that your average medium wage is here, and then you travel across this line and it doubles or triples. The policies that prevent someone from doing something like that are profoundly unjust. If you think about it, it's a daily human rights travesty that someone who lives here, it dies 10 years earlier or can't afford this or that. And then if they could just go here where there's plenty of space, and that we don't see ourselves as complicit in maintaining that status quo because we're concerned with this or that. But there is blood on people's hands as a result of that.
Yeah, well, I think the even darker interpretation of that, which I find myself thinking occasionally when it comes to climate, is that there's something we find comforting about the suffering of people living elsewhere, because it reassures us of our relative privilege and prosperity. And, it's not just that we don't want to be bothered to help the people in the developing world. It's that we actually like having them suffer. And I think about that, not just in terms of climate, as I mentioned, but, about the global vaccination rollout. The IMF in 2021 estimated that, I think it was global vaccination program would cost $60 billion. And they thought that the returns by 2025 would be $9 trillion. So it was like the biggest economic no-brainer you could possibly imagine. And even if the US paid for it entirely themselves, the returns even within the US economy would be so much bigger than the outlay. Yeah. And yet there was no interest in taking that up by any leader of any country or any group of countries around the world. We've, in fits and starts, talked about maybe loosening IP and maybe donating some vaccines here and there, but nothing like we're actually going to get the entire world vaccinated kind of a program. And that's just this is a deal in which not just the people of Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia would benefit, but Americans would benefit too. The economy would be so much stronger as a result that even just thinking about our narrow self-interest, it makes it worth doing. And we wouldn't even take that deal. So we didn't take the deal that maximized our own well-being. We didn't take the deal that maximized the world's well-being. We took the deal that maximize the difference between the people who were best off and the people who were worst off. And that is,
right. We're like, where's my stuff? And they're like, yeah, the people who would be making it in the already moral abomination sweatshop, they're dead. That's why they're not working on making this or that, right? Like when you put it in the starkest terms as it can be, it becomes so repugnant as to be almost paralyzed. Like you're just like, man, are we the worst? It's difficult to comprehend. There's one of the middle Stoics, his name was Heracles. He comes up with this exercise. He says that there's like these concentric circles. So the first circle is you. He says everyone's born thinking of themselves, right? I have to survive. Then you have your parents and your spouse and your children, and that these circles get bigger and bigger and bigger. And he's like, the point of the philosophy, which is funny because people think of Stoicism as this individualistic philosophy, which it is. He's like, the whole point of the philosophy is to figure out how to draw the outer rings inward, right? So how to care about the faceless person in India, although they literally do have a face, they're just faceless to you. That's how you justify not caring about them. But how to draw the 80-year-old woman dying at 70 in India instead of the 10 years that she's entitled to, her dying of air pollution. How do you pull that person into the inner circles to the degree in which you care about them and want to do something for them? But I don't think just in the form of mindless, meaningless sympathy, but like you said, let's approve this global vaccine package. Or what are you actually doing about these problems?
Were you asking me personally?
No. I'm saying that's
yeah.
No, there are I mean, you have written a lot about what to do, but the point we just don't do it. Like some people get to a place where they at least have empathy about it. Which is good.
On some level, that's also, there's a way in which that's kind of ugly too, because it's a way that we exercise our moral feelings without ever actually demanding anything from ourselves materially to fall from that. So it's a little bit like, we're going to the morality gym for a little while to feel guilty about our carbon footprint or whatever. By the way, I don't say any of this to say that I'm immune to it. The expanding circle idea that you talked about is interesting. I mean, Peter Singer writes about this too in a more modern context. And I've always found his formulation interesting in the sense that, it's certainly the case that our liberal cultures tell us that our circles are growing and more people are included and more people are counted as human and counted as equal over the centuries. And that's not just what we've been told. It is, from the broad strokes of history, true. But I also think, it's interesting to think about in terms of where we started the conversation about the sort of networked bad news bias that we have in our narrative impulses, where we now know so much about the rest of the world that we see so much more suffering, not just in the sense of poverty, but in the sense of natural disaster. And, there are just more bad news stories that rise to the level of global attention because we are all networked together. We're also made in certain ways more vulnerable because of those networks, although you could argue that on net we're less vulnerable. But there are some vulnerabilities that are introduced by that, by globalization effectively. But we're in this like incredible tragedy economy, narrative tragedy economy as a result of globalization that I think is really, really in the context of your expanding circles or whatever, is really novel as a human experience. Like we just didn't hear these stories in centuries past. And tragedies might have been overwhelming when they were local, but they were also experienced collectively by everyone who was local. And obviously in differential ways, but a community would see something immediate and understand that as a tragedy. And I don't think we really have a lot of the tools we maybe should try to develop for how to process and contextualize tragedies which we understand to be horrible, but which are, ultimately not even relevant to our particular lives. Like it's just a very different experience than we've ever had before as people.
Well, yeah, you go back not that many hundreds of years, and like, not only did they not know the bad stuff that was happening, let's say you live in Europe, you don't know what's happening in North America till the, a certain period there, you're not even aware that North America exists. You're not even aware that things are happening to those people, right? So like that, as our ability to understand more and more what's happening in the world, there are more things tugging at your heartstrings, which I think is good because it allows you to do something. But then you're right, it can become kind of this information overload where you're like, everything's terrible. I'm just going to care about the 7 people around me or whatever. I'm not.
Well, I think it gets back to what we were saying earlier about the way tiny adjustments to calibrations of any kind when applied to the entire planet have huge effects. So even if your bad news bias is just tiny, it's just like a little to the negative side. If you're really applying that to a planet of 8 billion people, it's going to add up in an absolutely overwhelming way. And I actually think that's a bigger part of the why is the media so depressing story than clickbait, which in many cases isn't as relevant anymore now that we're doing subscriber-based stuff. Yeah. Or like the sensationalism, or I think it really is just like, it's just like a little bit more of a story when something bad happens. Like people care a little bit more, and even just a little bit when you're talking about a global feed has an unbelievably dramatic effect.
Well, my first book was about media manipulation. So I've always thought about this, and you mentioned a word a couple of times. I think the bad news bias is there. The other distorting bias is just the human bias you mentioned, which is narrative. Like a journalist can't be like, here's a complicated series of facts, you figure it out, right? The journalist has to put it in the form of a narrative, or has to come up with an argument, an explanation. Like you have to put it in a story, right? To go back to the word of narrative. And so that's the other problem, is like people are consuming information day to day, even though our understanding is changing on a slightly different time span, and then events are transpiring on a different time span. So I think one of the things that makes, even if we could all immediately download, everyone give us a shared consciousness of all the problems of the world, it would be hard to mobilize us to solve those difficult problems. But that can't happen. Between us and the alignment we need is this inherently unreliable, unevenly distributed media system. Like, I wouldn't say I was a climate skeptic, or that I have been, but I would say that given my experiences with media, I was skeptical of some of the media, lenses on the climate story. And so then you play that out with lots of people. People don't trust the media. And then the media is how they learn about COVID. The media is how they learn about pollution deaths in India. The media is how we learn about this stuff. And we're in a real difficult situation because like now we can't even get people to understand the reality, let alone do something about the complicated reality once they learn about it.
I was just looking at some polling the other day. Yale does this it's kind of considered like the gold standard opinion polling about climate. They've been doing it for like 20 years. So they have a very, good running data set. And I think 72% of Americans think that global warming is happening. And 55% of Americans think that scientists agree that global warming is happening. So there are more Americans who believe this is happening than think that there's scientific consensus about it, which is an incredible.
What is that?
Well, I think it gets back to the basic trust in institutions and authorities that like you're talking about. But so, I mean, what it basically, there's part of it, which is just a basic distrust in elites and institutions and media in particular. I think part of it is also, a sign of some amount of disinformation and denial and the sort of fossil fuel campaigns that have happened over the last couple of decades that's playing some role. But nevertheless, it's remarkable that there's a really significant chunk of people, even among those who are discounting the conventional scientific wisdom, who think both that they know better than scientists and that they are more worried about climate than scientists. Like 17% of America, that's the gap between those two numbers. 17%, that's, what is that, 50 million people? Wow, that's a lot of people.
Sure. Yeah.
And we hear a lot about people who distrust the science and distrust the public narrative, but we don't hear about those who distrust it in the other direction very often. And it seems like, at least according to this like I said, it's sort of considered the gold standard polling. There's quite a lot of them.
I always go back to that study that said like 15% of Americans think that chocolate milk comes from brown cows. And then I use that at like whenever they're like, can you believe this many million people think this or this many million? I'm like, do you know how many 15% of America is? Right? The same thing. And you're like, and they look at a cow and they think that's a chocolate milk cow. And you're just like, okay. Again, when you think about percentages, that's a lot of dumb people or a lot of people who aren't thinking very much.
I used to use the number of people who believe that aliens were living among us on planet Earth, but now it seems like that's something
that might be true.
Former directors of the CIA now believe. And on the bigger question, it's something that I've tried to do more in my COVID writing than in my climate writing. But I've tried to be a sort of counter narrative writer and someone who treats the narrative itself as a sort of subject of an area of inquiry.
Sure.
And I, who knows how useful that is, but it's been really, really interesting to me. Just all of the complicated ways that we, as we were talking about earlier, have narrativized this pandemic almost beyond the point of of it being sensible, legible to us. And, it's just wild, the things that our brains have allowed us to do. And I think a lot about how liberals I know spent 2020 yelling at people for going to visit their family at Thanksgiving and being like, the thing we need to do most of all is to protect one another and to sacrifice in order to protect one another. And then by 2021, they were really just like, your death is on your own hands. You've chosen not to get vaccinated. And I don't want to do anything to help you or stop the disease from getting to you.
Well,
and those are the same people within like a year.
Yeah. Well, don't you see this in the peer group that we're in? Because we both have young children where you're like, they were hardcore. Everyone's got to get vaccinated, vaccine mandates, blah, blah, blah. And then you're like, so, hey, I heard your kid just turned 5. Did you get him vaccinated? And they're like, I think I'm going to wait. Right. Like the difference between like the decision they made personally for themselves and then the cognitive dissonance they've picked up about kids and COVID. Of course, it's super, it's not nearly as dangerous for children as it is for adults, which is wonderful news. But like I was talking to a reporter I know about this. I was saying that what the government did is the government was like, good. They wanted to convince people. They're like, there's no danger sending your kids to school. Right. And then so all the parents sent their kids to school. And then they're like, and then by the way, you can vaccinate them now to make them safer. But they already internalized the idea that COVID's not dangerous. So why would you go take this precaution if it's not dangerous? Right. It's like cognitive dissonance being this super powerful force. But I found it really interesting. The same people, they are super hardcore on COVID, shaming people who visited their families, shaming people who didn't get vaccinated. And then they're like, I'm not going to get my kids vaccinated though. Right. So it's like when they actually take that, when they can do something tangibly themselves, but they feel a little weird about it and it's not obvious, then the difference between behavior and public morality is different.
And there, just to talk numbers for a second, like 350,000 Americans died of COVID in 2020. About 400,000 died in 2021. We're on track for about 250 or 300,000 deaths this year. So we're like in the ballpark of the previous years. And it's very different. We're taking many fewer precautions. So if we had been this reckless, or reckless is probably too loaded a term, but if we had been this carefree about mitigation in 2020, we would have had many more deaths. Same in 2021. It's not exactly an apples to apples comparison. But just at the level of like ultimate death toll, like think about this as a human story, as a tragic human story. How big is it? How big is that tragedy? I mean, 250,000 American lives is an enormous toll. And most of the scientists that I speak to expect that, that'll be a little bit lower next year, probably in the range of 100 to 150. But we're not getting like down to nobody knows anybody who's dying of COVID. We're getting down just in the range where like, oh, it's only grandparents that are dying of COVID. Right. And, in some basic way, actually, speaking of narrative, you kind of could have said the same thing in 2020. That would have been more of an oversimplification then than it is now. But nevertheless, I think one of the big things that was undersold by public health authorities in 2020 was the age skew of the disease. And I do think
because they wanted people to care. They didn't want them to be able to do precisely what we're doing now, which is pretend that it's not real.
Totally. And there's some wisdom in that. On the other hand, like this age skew is so profound. I mean, your risk doubles every 8 years about. So someone who's in their 80s is like thousands of times more at risk of death than someone in their 20s. That is not just like 8 times more, 10 times more, 12 times more. It is a whole different disease. And you know, when you get vaccinated, that reduces your risk of mortality by about the equivalent of about 20 or 25 years. So someone who's, you know, a well-vaccinated 85-year-old is still more at risk than a totally unvaccinated 55-year-old. And that's how profound and ginormous the age skew is. And yet all through the beginning of the pandemic, we were given such, you know, a sense of uniform threat and uniform risk. I think, like you say, for some good reasons, but it ultimately was, you know, it was ultimately a distortion of the story that anybody looking at the data could follow themselves.
Well, we're not good at changing narratives, right? So like people do this now to undermine what they're saying about COVID now. They go, oh, but they said this, but they said this. A lot of what they said this, when they said this, it was true, or it was it was the understanding of that time. Whether it was true or not is what they believed. It's what the information made it look like was true. And then that narrative changes. And then once people have said several times, it's like, oh, it's over. And it's like, maybe it was, and then it's changed. So I have this bookstore here in Texas, and we still require masks. We're probably like the only business left in America that does at this point. But I remember somebody posted a picture, and then someone said, well, what's this mask? Like, I thought the pandemic was over. And like, that's also a narrative, right? In their head, they've decided a thing is over. And so you can't change, people can't change things. And I think that is the problem with narrative is life. The story is always changing if there is a story. But once you lock into a narrative or an identity around that narrative, it's very difficult to update or counter the narrative, as you were saying with your writing.
Yeah, I mean, it's the mask story is such an interesting one to me. So, you know, we now, quote unquote, know that there are some meaningful benefits in reducing transmission through high quality masks. So N95s, KN95s. But for most of the pandemic, we were not given advice that was focused on that. It was focused on covering your mouth with anything. Yes. And actually the science that we have from that suggests that the effects there are quite limited. And, you know, there are often people point to this big Bangladesh randomized control trial, which found some effect from surgical masks. It found zero effect on cloth masks. And the effect on surgical masks was, you know, they grew the uptake of mask wearing by 3,000%. And the reduction of disease transmission was, I think, by like 15%. So in theory, that bargain at the peak of a pandemic, at the peak of a wave, that bargain may well be worth taking in a local way. You know, I personally have always thought like, well, what's the big deal? Like you just wear a mask. It's, you know, even if it has a marginal benefit, it's like, what's the cost to me? That seems like a very easy pro-social thing to do. But I wonder if we rewound the clock to, say, April, May of 2020, when the public health establishment was like, you know, turning towards mask wearing, having been against mask wearing at the very outbreak of the pandemic and saying everybody should wear a mask. If they had known then what we know now about the relatively limited effect of cloth and surgical masks on transmission, would they have still been giving that advice? Would they still choose to do that? And my own feeling is that... Or
would they have chosen that as the hill if they knew the political consequences?
Like, the political consequences have been so enormous. I mean, when people talk about, you know, lockdowns, it's like, there haven't been lockdowns since the summer of 2020. What we've had is mask mandates. Like, but that's not the same thing. And yet, for people who are opposed to pandemic mitigation policies, they sort of became the same thing. And they were so offended by any public mask policy, but also any private establishment, like requiring masks, that they sort of, I don't know, they developed a deep hostility to it. I think out of proportion, both to the cost to the person, but also to the benefit. And I wonder if we would have taken that bargain, like if we could have avoided that, at least part of the pandemic culture war, at relatively limited cost to the actual levels of the disease, if we had just chosen to, like, whatever, not push
no,
a 15%
that's
effect. Yeah.
That's a really interesting counterfactual, because part of the reason they were like, there's two reasons they were saying don't wear masks at first. One was they didn't have very many masks. And two, the studies that they had, it wasn't that masks didn't work. It's that masks were a complicated or ineffectual public health measure for the population at large, right? So there may have been an argument where there's a counterfactual where they decide masks are not going to be part of the government toolkit, but then you and I, as individuals who had done research or learning, we're wearing a mask voluntarily everywhere we go. We're probably not getting COVID, but then COVID doesn't become the politicized thing that it becomes to the same degree. And then maybe people actually listen better when they say, hey, these vaccines, this is the main thing to treat COVID, or this other treatment, or whatever it is. Yeah, maybe the thing goes differently. And then you're like, man, that gut call that whoever made in, March, April of 2020, that actually was the right call. And then they second guess themselves. And then, here we are, and we'll never know.
It's interesting in the, when you play out the whole narrative, because according to at least survey data, which is probably misleading, but maybe directionally accurate, in the fall and winter surge of 2020 into 2021, there was very little difference in mask wearing among even the most conservative places in the country and the most liberal places in the country. So we had a narrative that like red states and Republicans were like totally unwilling to mask. That became true in 2021 much more than it had been true in 2020. But I think it like that narrative, which existed in 2020, primed us for the same fights over vaccination, which became much more significant and profound. And even there are some really interesting counterfactuals. So we know that the FDA delayed approval of the vaccines until after the election for, again, it's a kind of a defensible position. They didn't want it to be a campaign trail issue. But even a delay of 3 or 4 weeks then would have made a really profound narrative difference, in the sense that Trump would have been talking about the imminent vaccines in the last weeks of the campaign. He might have won because the margins were small enough that maybe some additional boost there would have helped him, in which case maybe we wouldn't have had the partisan split that we have today at all. And that's just like, a regulatory decision.
Or the rollout was then bungled even more.
It
also could be infinitely worse in so many other ways, and probably would be. I was going to say, as far as policy goes, the other interesting thing I found for COVID stuff is like, basically everyone's like, life's back to normal, do whatever you want. The only people I know that have strict COVID protocols that treat it seriously at this point are musicians who are still on tour, because there's something you lose by getting sick, right? I've had to do this as a speaker. It's like I've not had a gig in like further than 2 weeks apart, like basically consistently for like the last year or so, right? So like there's not a window in which I can get COVID that it would not cost me a large amount of money, right? And so like I have to individually think about the choices that I'm going to make. And so there's also this interesting dichotomy when, as you were saying, like when COVID becomes endemic and we all have to make these individual decisions, there's still people for whom COVID is costly, either because they're immunocompromised, they're someone on the edges of society or life, or there's someone who is trying to do or see certain things. So it's this weird thing where it puts the burden on the individual to have to make these choices. But then because things have been politicized and are complicated, people don't actually really know what those choices are. So it's a weird sort of balkanized world that we live in now.
Yeah, I think everybody's sort of confused and choosing to relate to that confusion by indifference.
Yes. Well, it's like we are with all things. Like if I don't think about it, then I don't have to be confused by it. If I don't think about it, I don't have to make decisions by it. And then if I don't think about, as you were saying, that the lifespan in India is 10 years lower because of pollution, then I don't have to make any changes. I don't have to live my life any differently. And although, and this may be a good place to wrap up, the other problem with COVID climate change, et cetera, is that these aren't things that can be dealt with individually, right? So it's like, hey, the climate is, all this stuff is happening, and so I'm going to recycle or do whatever I can as an individual. This is nothing compared to Kylie Jenner's 17-minute private jet flight, right? Like there's not anything I can do as an individual that would make even a microscopic difference compared to corporate or national decisions that people are making unthinkingly that have enormous impact. So it comes back to, how do you solve a collective action problem?
Well, I think it might be useful to answer that first by talking about the pandemic and then about climate. So we have evolved the very particular sort of risk assessment dynamic that you're describing, where it's basically all on the individual to make decisions about what they're comfortable with and what they're not. And I think in some way that is useful and empowering, that individuals can make their own assessments and make their own decisions. But we're talking about navigating a landscape that is shaped profoundly by collective and social actions. And by that, I don't mean whether New York City is in a lockdown. What I mean is, like, we knew in spring of 2020 that better ventilation systems in public places would make a huge difference. We did not spend that money to upgrade ventilation systems in schools, on buses.
Wear cloth masks.
Right. We were like, we're going to put the burden on the cost on the individual. And as a result, we are living with a considerably riskier environment than we needed to. And there are other ways which play out slightly more subtly. I mean, you were talking about the touring musicians, speaking gigs in a slightly less high rolling kind of way. You just have people who are like, they don't have paid sick leave.
Yeah.
So if they want to protect themselves or their coworkers and they get COVID, they can't do like a 2-week quarantine. Right. And they can't elect to do that. The law does not support them doing that. And that's really broken. Totally. We should, if we're gonna try to empower individuals to navigate the risk landscape of their own lives on their own, which I think is, like I said, a pretty useful thing to do. We should also be trying to design that landscape so it minimizes the absolute risk to everyone and makes it possible for people who want to make responsible choices to make responsible choices. And the same is absolutely true in climate. So, the average American refrigerator uses more carbon than the average person living in sub-Saharan Africa. Like, you just cannot live in the United States responsibly by global standards when it comes to carbon. You cannot live in Western Europe.
I have 2 refrigerators. I got an extra one in the garage, right?
Yeah, and your flat screen is just as bad. And you can buy your EV. You can do what you can to try to power your home through personal solar power, but many people can't do that.
I just did this, by the way. I don't know how anyone can afford to do it. It was insanely expensive. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I could have just bought, I probably should have just bought, it would have been better for the world if I had just bought a small house and put a homeless person in it. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Like that's how much it cost to put solar on my house. Like, it was insanely expensive. Yeah. And
well, in Texas, it's state by state. There are tax incentives elsewhere that make it better, but it can be cumbersome and certainly beyond the reach of working class, poor people in the country who are just going to get whatever electricity comes into the plug in their wall and don't have any say about it. But collectively, we have a say in what kind of electricity goes into the plug in your wall. Right. And we have a say in whether our grid wastes 2/3 of the power that's put into it through waste heat, or whether it delivers it much more efficiently. Right. On a longer time scale, we can be pouring money into carbon neutral jet fuel so that a 17-minute private jet flight doesn't have a carbon impact at all, let alone one that is so wildly disproportionate. And this is true of everything. It's a sort of a naive, basic thing to say, but it's really true of every aspect of climate. That we are living in a policy landscape that has been designed for us in part to maximize the use of fossil fuels. And if we are able to change that architecture so that fossil fuels are less present, less dominant, or ideally absent, it means that we can make any choice we want to make without any guilt or responsibility at all. If we get to a genuinely net zero future, which is, it'll take a lot, But I think we will get there. The question is whether we're going to get there in 2060, 2070, 2100. But when we get there, we won't have to be thinking about our consumption patterns in terms of environmental guilt, because anything we consume will have no carbon footprint at all. And the fact that we're not excited by that prospect says a lot about, how broken our political economy is, but it also says a lot about our limited moral imaginations, that we're not even
political vision.
Both. Like we're not even interested in bringing about a future where we don't have to think about how much of a burden we're imposing on the rest of the world. We can just make the choices we want to make and trust that the impact will be neutral, responsible, sustainable, however you want to think about it. That's just like, to circle back to some of the themes we were talking about earlier in the conversation, like, if you're the kind of person who is burdened by a sense of guilt and responsibility, there is a path forward to, eliminate that from your sense of, the political shape of the world and the political shape of your own life. And yet we're not moving, I think, nearly fast enough to sort of embrace that opportunity, which is worth embracing for many reasons, like, saving the 10 million people a year who are dying from air pollution, more prosperity, economic growth, more, global justice, environmental justice, et cetera. But even at the level of like the selfish consumer American individual, you're like, you could be,
You'd have more freedom. If we made these larger policy choices, you would have more individual freedom to do what you wanted and live how you wanted.
Yeah. And you would have to feel much less guilt about making those choices, even if they were, by today's standards, like obscenely wasteful, grandiose, and ultimately harmful to the planet. In a future that's not that far off, those same choices wouldn't have any of those impacts at all, and could be, just sort of embarrassing on a personal level.
No, I will say, once we got the solar panels installed, I was much less of the cliche dad of like giving a shit where the thermostat was.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's not really my problem. Like, you know what I mean? Like you solve the problem at the source instead of dealing with the piddly shit on the margins.
That seems like a good deal.
It was not a good deal, but I made it work. Anyways, dude, this was awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time.
No, my pleasure. Great to talk. And yeah, let's hopefully cross paths again soon.